Chapter 16. This state of prayer, not one of idleness, but of noble action, wrought by the Spirit of God, and in dependence upon Him, the communication of His life and union. Some people, hearing of the prayer of silence, have wrongly imagined that the soul remains inactive, lifeless, and without movement. But the truth is that its action is more noble and more extensive than it ever was before it entered this degree, since it is moved by God Himself, and acted upon by His Spirit. St. Paul desires that we should be led by the Spirit of God. I do not say that there must be no action, but that we must act in dependence upon the divine movement. This is admirably set forth by Ezekiel. The prophet saw wheels which had the spirit of life, and wherever this spirit was to go, they went. They went on, or stood, or were lifted up as they were moved, for the spirit of life was in them, but they never went back. It should be the same with the soul. It should suffer itself to be moved and guided by the living Spirit who is in it, following His direction and no other. Now this Spirit will never lead it to go backwards, that is, to reflect upon the creature, or to lean upon itself, but always to go forward, pressing continually towards the mark. This action of the soul is a restful action. When it acts of itself, it acts with effort, and is therefore more conscious of its action. But when it acts in dependence upon the Spirit of grace, its action is so free, so easy, so natural, that it does not seem to act at all. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me, because He delighted in me. As soon as the soul has commenced its course towards its centre, from that moment its action becomes vigorous, that is, its course towards the centre which attracts it, which infinitely surpasses the velocity of any other movement. It is action then, but an action so noble, so peaceful, so tranquil, that it seems to the soul as though it were not acting at all, because it rests, as it were, naturally. When a wheel is only turning with a moderate speed, it can easily be distinguished, but when it goes quickly, no part of it can be distinctly seen. So the soul which remains at rest in God has an action infinitely noble and exalted, yet very peaceful. The greater its peace, the greater is its velocity, because it is abandoned to the Spirit, who moves it and makes it act. This Spirit is God Himself, who draws us, and in drawing makes us run to Him, as the bride well knew when she said, "Draw me, we will run." Draw me, O my divine centre, by my inmost heart. My powers and my sensibilities will run at Thy attraction. This attraction alone is a balm which heals me, and a perfume which draws. We will run, she says, because of the savour of Thy good ointments. This attracting virtue is very strong, but the soul follows it very gladly, and as it is equally strong and sweet, it attracts by its strength, and delights by its sweetness. The bride says, "Draw me, we will run." She speaks of herself, and to herself. Draw me. There is the unity of the object which is attracted. We will run. There is the correspondence of all the powers and sensibilities which follow in the train of the centre of the heart. It is not a question of remaining in idleness, but of acting in dependence upon the Spirit of God, who animates us, since it is in Him that we live and move and have our being. This calm dependence upon the Spirit of God is absolutely necessary, and causes the soul in a short time to attain the simplicity and unity in which it was created. It was created one and simple, like God. In order, then, to answer to the end of our creation, we must quit the multiplicity of our own actions, to enter into the simplicity and unity of God, in whose image we were created. The Spirit of God is one only, yet manifold, and its unity does not prevent its multiplicity. We enter into God's unity when we are united to His Spirit, because then we have the same Spirit that He has, and we are multiplied outwardly as regards His dispositions, without leaving the unity. So that, as God acts infinitely, and we are of one spirit with Him, we act much more than we could do by our own action. We must suffer ourselves to be guided by wisdom. This wisdom is more moving than any motion. Let us, then, remain in dependence upon His action, and our action will be vigorous indeed. All things were made by the Word, and without Him was not anything made that was made. God, in creating us, created us in His image, after His likeness. He gave to us the Spirit of the Word, by the breath of life, which He breathed into us when we were created in the image of God, by the participation of the life of the Word, who is the image of His Father. Now this life is one, simple, pure, intimate, and fruitful. The devil having disfigured this beautiful image, it became necessary that this Word, whose breath had been breathed into us at our creation, should come to restore it. It is necessary that it should be He, because He is the image of the Father, and a defaced image cannot be repaired by its own action, but by the action of Him who seeks to restore it. Our action, then, should be to put ourselves into a position to suffer the action of God, and to allow the Word to retrace His image in us. An image, if it could move, would by its movement prevent the sculptor's perfecting it. Every movement of our own hinders the work of the heavenly sculptor, and produces false features. We must then remain silent, and only move as He moves us. Jesus Christ has life in Himself, and He must communicate life to all who live. That this action is the most noble cannot be denied. Things are only of value as the principle in which they originate is noble, grand, and elevated. Actions committed by a divine principle are divine actions, whereas the actions of the creature, however good they may appear, are human actions, or, at best, they are virtuous actions, if they are done with the help of grace. Jesus says that He has life in Himself. All other beings have but a borrowed life, but the Word has life in Himself, and as He is communicative, He desires to communicate this life to men. We must then give place to this life, that it may flow in us, which can only be done by evacuation, and the loss of the life of Adam and of our own action, as St. Paul assures us. If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things are become new. This can only be brought about by the death of ourselves and of our own action, that the action of God may be substituted for it. We do not profess, then, to be without action, but only to act in dependence upon the Spirit of God, suffering his action to take the place of our own. Jesus shows us this in the Gospel. Martha did good things, but because she did them of her own spirit, Christ reproved her for them. The spirit of man is turbulent and boisterous, therefore it does little, though it appears to do much. "Martha, Martha," said Jesus, "thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her." What had she chosen, this Magdalene? Peace, tranquillity, and repose. She apparently ceased to act. That she might be moved by the Spirit of God, she ceased to live, that Christ might live in her. This is why it is so necessary to renounce ourselves and all our own works to follow Jesus. For we cannot follow him unless we are animated with his Spirit. In order that the Spirit of Christ may dwell in us, our own spirit must give place to him. He that is joined to the Lord, says St. Paul, is one spirit. It is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God. What is this drawing near? It is the beginning of union. Union has its beginning, its continuation, its completion, and its consummation. The commencement of union is an inclination towards God. When the soul is converted in the manner I have described, it has an inclination to its centre, and a strong tendency to union. This tendency is the commencement. Then it adheres, which happens when it approaches nearer to God. Then it is united to him, and finally becomes one with him. That is, because one spirit with him. And it is then that this Spirit, which proceeded from God, returns to him as its end. It is, then, necessary that we should enter this way, which is the divine motion and the Spirit of Jesus Christ. St. Paul says, "If any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his." To be Christ's, then, we must suffer ourselves to be filled with his Spirit, and emptied of our own. Our hearts must be evacuated. St. Paul, in the same place, proves to us the necessity of this divine motion. He says, "As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." The divinely imparted Spirit is the Spirit of divine sonship. Therefore the same apostle continues, "Ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the Spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father." This Spirit is no other than the Spirit of Christ, by whom we participate in his sonship. And this Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the sons of God. As soon as the soul leaves itself to be moved by the Spirit of God, it experiences the witness of this divine sonship, and this witness serves the more to increase its joy, and it makes it know that it is called to the liberty of the sons of God, and that the Spirit it has received is not a spirit of bondage, but of liberty. The Spirit of the divine motion is so necessary for all things, that Paul founds this necessity upon our ignorance of the things that we ask for. The Spirit, he says, helpeth our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us, with groanings which cannot be uttered. This is conclusive. If we do not know what to pray for, nor how to ask as we ought for what is necessary for us, and if it is needful that the Spirit who is in us, to whose motion we abandon ourselves, should ask it for us, ought we not to leave him to do it? He does it with groanings which cannot be uttered. This Spirit is the Spirit of the Word, who is always heard, as he says himself, I know that thou hearest me always. If we leave it to the Spirit within us to ask and to pray, we shall always be answered. Why so? O great Apostle, mystic teacher, so deeply taught in the inner life, teach us why. It is, he adds, because he that searcheth the hearts knoweth what is the mind of the Spirit, because he maketh intercession for the saints according to the will of God. That is to say, this Spirit only asks that which it is God's will to give. It is God's will that we should be saved, and that we should be perfect. He asks then for all that is necessary to our perfection. Why, after this, should we be burdened with superfluous cares, and be wearied in the greatness of our way, without ever saying, there is no hope in ourselves, and therefore resting in God? God himself invites us to cast all care upon him, and he complains, in inconceivable goodness, that we employ our strength, our riches and our treasure, in countless exterior things, although there is so little joy to be found in them all. Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labour for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness. Oh, if it were known what happiness there is in thus hearkening unto God, and how the soul is strengthened by it! All flesh must be silent before the Lord. All self-effort must cease when he appears. In order still further to induce us to abandon ourselves to him without reserve, God assures us that we need fear nothing from such abandonment, because he has a special individual care over each of us. He says, can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, she may forget, yet will I not forget thee. Ah, words full of consolation! Who, on hearing them, can fear to abandon himself utterly to the guidance of God? Chapter 17. Distinction between exterior and interior actions. Those of the soul in this condition are interior, but habitual, continued, direct, profound, simple, and imperceptible, being a continual sinking in the ocean of divinity. Similitude of a vessel. How to act in the absence of sensible supports. The actions of men are either exterior or interior. The exterior are those which appear outwardly, and have a sensible object, possessing neither good nor evil qualities, excepting as they receive them from the interior principle in which they originate. It is not of these that I intend to speak, but only of interior actions, which are those actions of the soul by which it applies itself inwardly to some object, or turns away from some other. When being applied to God, I desire to commit an action of a different nature from those which he would prompt, I turn away from God, and I turn towards created things, more or less according to the strength or weakness of my action. If, being turned towards the creature, I wish to return to God, I must commit the action of turning away from the creature and turning towards God, and thus The more perfect is this action, the more complete will be the conversion. Until I am perfectly converted, I need several actions to turn me towards God. Some are done all at once, others gradually, but my action ought to lead me to turn to God, employing all the strength of my soul for Him, as it is written, "Therefore even now, saith the Lord, turn ye even to me with all your heart." Thou shalt return unto the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul. God only asks for our heart. My son, give me thy heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. To give the heart to God is to have its gaze, its strength, and its vigour all centred in Him, to follow His will. We must then, after we have applied to God, remain always turned towards Him. But as the mind of man is weak, and the soul, being accustomed to turn towards earthly things, is easily turned away from God, it must, as soon as it perceives that it is turned towards outward things, resume its former position in God by a simple act of return to Him. And as several repeated acts form a habit, the soul contracts a habit of conversion, and from action it passes to a habitual condition. The soul, then, must not seek by means of any efforts or works of its own to come near to God. This is seeking to perform one action by means of others, instead of by a simple action remaining attached to God alone. If we believe that we must commit no actions, we are mistaken, for we are always acting, but each one must act according to his degree. I will endeavour to make this point clear, as, for want of understanding it, it presents a difficulty to many Christians. There are passing and distinct actions, and continued actions, direct acts, and reflected acts. All cannot perform the first, and all are not in a condition to perform the others. The first actions should be committed by those who are turned away from God. They ought to turn to Him by a distinct action, more or less strong according to their distance from Him. By a continued action, I understand that by which the soul is completely turned towards its God by a direct action, which it does not renew unless it has been interrupted, but which exists. The soul, being altogether turned in this way, is in love, and remains there. And he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God. Then the soul may be said to be in a habitual act, resting even in this action. But its rest is not idle, for it has an action always in force, viz., a gentle sinking in God, in which God attracts it more and more strongly, and following this attraction, and resting in love, it sinks more and more in this love, and has an action infinitely stronger, more vigorous, and more prompt than that action which forms only the return. Now, the soul which is in this profound and strong action, being turned towards its God, does not perceive this action, because it is direct and not reflex, so that persons in this condition, not knowing how rightly to describe it, say that they have no action. But they are mistaken. They were never more active. It would be better to say they do not distinguish any action, than that they do not commit any. The soul itself does not act of itself, I admit, but it is drawn, and it follows the attracting power. Love is the weight which sinks it, as a person who falls in the sea sinks, and would sink to infinity if the sea were infinite, and without perceiving it sinking. it would sink to the most profound depths with an incredible speed. It is then incorrect to say that no actions are committed. All commit actions, but all do not commit them in the same manner, and the abuse arises from the fact that those who know that action is inevitable wish it to be distinct and sensible. But sensible action is for beginners, and the other for those more advanced. To stop with the first would be to deprive ourselves of the last, and to wish to commit the last before having passed the first would be an equal abuse. Everything must be done in its season. Each state has its commencement, its progress, and its end. There is no act which has not its beginning. At first we must work with effort, but afterwards we enjoy the fruit of our labour. When a vessel is in the harbour, the sailors have a difficulty in bringing it into the open sea, but once there they easily turn it in the direction in which they wish to navigate. So when the soul is in sin, it needs an effort to drag it out. The cords which bind it must be loosened then, by means of strong and vigorous action. It must be drawn within itself, little by little, leaving the harbour, and being turned within, which is the place to which its voyage should be directed. When the vessel is thus turned, in proportion as it advances in the sea, it leaves the land behind it, and the further it goes from the land, the less effort is needed to carry it along. At last it begins to sail gently, and the vessel goes on so rapidly that the oars become useless. What does the pilot do then? He is contented with spreading the sails and sitting at the helm. Spreading the sails is simply laying ourselves before God to be moved by His Spirit. Sitting at the helm is preventing our heart from leaving the right way, rowing it gently and leading it according to the movement of the Spirit of God, who gradually takes possession of it, as the wind gradually fills the sails and impels the vessel forward. So long as the vessel sails before the wind, the mariners rest from their labour. They voyage farther in an hour while they rest in this manner, and leave the ship to be carried along by the wind, than they would in a much longer time by their own efforts. And if they wish to row, besides the fatigue which would result from it, their labour would be useless, and would only serve to retard the vessel. This is the conduct we should pursue in our inner life, and in acting thus we shall advance more in a short time by the divine guidance than we ever could do by our own efforts. If only you will try this way, you will find it the easiest possible. When the wind is contrary, if the wind and the tempest are violent, the anchor must be thrown in the sea to stop the vessel. This anchor is trust in God, and hope in His goodness, waiting in patience for the tempest to cease, and for a favourable wind to return, as David did. "I waited patiently for the Lord," he says, "and He inclined unto me." Chapter 18. The dryness of preachers, and the various evils which arise from their failing to teach heart prayer. Exhortation to pastors to lead people towards this form of prayer, without amusing them with studied and methodical devotion. If all those who are working for the conquest of souls sought to win them by the heart, leading them first of all to prayer and to the inner life, they would see many and lasting conversions. But so long as they only address themselves to the outside, and instead of drawing people to Christ by occupying their hearts with Him, they only give them 1,000 precepts for outward observances, they will see but little fruit, and that will not be lasting. When once the heart is won, other defects are easily corrected. This is why God particularly asks for the heart. By this means alone would be prevented the drunkenness, blasphemy, lewdness, enmity, and robbery which are prevalent in the world. Jesus Christ would reign universally, and the church everywhere would be revived. Error only takes possession of the soul in the absence of faith and prayer. If men could be taught to believe simply, and to pray, instead of disputing amongst themselves, they would be gently led to Christ. Oh, how inestimable is the loss of those who neglect the inner life! Oh, what an account will they have to render to God, who have the charge of souls, for not having discovered the hidden treasure to all those whom they serve in the ministry of the Word. The excuse is given that there is danger in this way, or that ignorant people are incapable of spiritual things. The oracle of truth assures us that God has hid these things from the wise and prudent, and has revealed them to babes. And what danger can there be in walking in the only true way, which is Jesus Christ, in giving ourselves to Him, looking to Him continually, putting all our trust in His grace, and tending, with all the forces of our souls, to His pure love? Far from the simple ones being incapable of this perfection, they are the most suitable for it, because they are more docile, more humble, and more innocent, and as they do not reason, they are not so attached to their own light. Having no science, they more readily suffer themselves to be guided by the Spirit of God, while others who are blind in their own sufficiency resist the divine inspiration. God tells us, too, that it is to the simple He gives understanding by the entrance of His word. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The Lord preserveth the simple. I was brought low, and He helped me. O ye who have the oversight of souls, see that you do not prevent the little ones from going to Christ. His words to His disciples were, "Suffer little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of God." Jesus only said this to His disciples because they wished to keep the children away from Him. Often the remedy is applied to the body when the disease is at the heart. The reason why we have so little success in seeking to reform men is that we direct our efforts to the outside, and all that we can do there soon passes off. But if we went to give them first the key of the interior, the outside would be reformed at once with a natural facility. And this is very easy. To teach them to seek God in their heart, to think of Him, to return to Him when they find they have turned away, to do all and suffer all for the sake of pleasing Him. This is to direct them to the source of all grace, and to make them find there all that is necessary for their sanctification. O you who serve souls, I conjure you to put them first of all into this way, which is Jesus Christ, and it is He who conjures you to do this, by the blood He has shed for the souls He confides to your care. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem, O dispensers of His grace, preachers of His word, ministers of His sacraments. Establish His kingdom, and in order to establish it truly, make it reign over hearts. For as it is the heart alone which can oppose His empire, it is by the subjection of the heart that His sovereignty is most honoured. Alas, we seek to make studied prayers, and by wishing to arrange them too much we render them impossible. We have alienated children from the best of fathers in seeking to teach them a polished language. Go, poor children, and speak to your heavenly Father in your natural language, however uncultivated it may be. It is not so to Him. A father loves best the speech which is put in disorder by love and respect, because he sees that it comes from the heart. It is more to him than a dry harangue, vain and unfruitful, though well studied. Oh, how certain glances of love charm and ravish him! They express infinitely more than all language and reason. By wishing to teach how to love himself with method, much of this love has been lost. Oh, it is not necessary to teach the art of loving. The language of love is barbarous to him who does not love, and we cannot learn to love God better than by loving Him. The Spirit of God does not need our arrangements. He takes shepherds at His pleasure to make them prophets, and far from closing the palace of prayer to any, as it is imagined, He leaves the doors open to all, and wisdom is ordered to cry in the public places. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. As for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, Come and eat of my bread, and drink of the wine which I have mingled. Did not Christ thank His Father that He had hidden these things from the wise and prudent, and had revealed them to babes? Chapter 19. After the preceding ways, there remains an after way, preparatory to divine union, in which wisdom and justice make the passive purification of the soul, all which is treated in detail in the following treatise, entitled Spiritual Torrents. It is impossible to attain divine union by the way of meditation alone, or even by the affections, or by any luminous or understood prayer. There are several reasons. These are principal. First, according to Scripture, no man shall see God and live. Now, all discursive exercises of prayer, or even of active contemplation, regarded as an end, and not as preparation for the passive, are exercises of life by which we cannot see God, that is, become united to Him. All that is of man, and of his own industry, however noble and elevated it may be, must die. St. John tells us that there was silence in heaven. Heaven represents the depths and centre of the soul, where all must be in silence when the majesty of God appears. All that belongs to our own efforts, or to ourselves in any way, must be destroyed, because nothing is opposed to God but appropriation, and all the malignity of man is in this appropriation, which is the source of his evil, so that the more a soul loses its appropriation, the more it becomes pure. Secondly, in order to unite two things so opposed as the purity of God and the impurity of the creature, the simplicity of God and the multiplicity of the creature, God must operate alone, for this can never be done by the effort of the creature, since two things cannot be united unless there is some relation or resemblance between them, as an impure metal would never unite with one that was pure and refined. What does God do then? He sends before Him His own wisdom, as fire will be sent upon the earth to consume by its activity all the impurity that is there. Fire consumes all things, and nothing resists its activity. It is the same with wisdom. It consumes all impurity in the creature, to prepare him for divine union. This impurity, so opposed to union, is appropriation and activity, appropriation because it is the source of the real impurity, which can never be united to essential purity, as the sun's rays may touch the mud, but cannot unite with it. Activity, because God, being in an infinite repose, in order that the soul may be united to him, it must participate in his repose, without which there can be no union, because of the dissemblance, and to unite two things, they must be in a proportionate rest. It is for this reason that the soul can only attain divine union by the rest of its will, and it can only be united to God when it is in a central rest and in the purity of its creation. To purify the soul, God makes use of wisdom, as fire is used for the purification of gold. It is certain that gold can only be purified by fire, which gradually consumes all that is earthly and foreign, and separates it from the gold. It is not sufficient that the earth should be changed into gold. It is necessary that the fire should melt and dissolve it, to remove from it all that is earthly. And this gold is put in the fire so many times that it loses its impurity and all necessity of its purification. Then it is fit to be employed in the most excellent workmanship. And if this gold is impure in the end, it is because it has contracted fresh defilement by coming in contact with other bodies. But this impurity is only superficial, and does not prevent its being used, whereas its former impurity was hidden within it, and as it were, identified with its nature. In addition to this, you will remark that gold of an inferior degree of purity cannot mix with that of a superior purity. The one must contract the impurity of the other, or else impart its own purity to it. Put a refined gold with an unrefined one, what can the goldsmith ever do with it? He will have all the impurity taken from the second piece, that it may be able to mix with the first. This is what St. Paul tells us, that the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. He adds that if any man's work should be found to deserve burning, he should be saved, so as by fire. That means that though there are some works which are good and which God receives, yet so that he who has done them may be pure, they too must pass through the fire, in order that all appropriation, that is, all that was his own, may be taken from them. God will judge our righteousness, because by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified, but by the righteousness of God which is by faith. This being understood, I say that, in order that man may be united to his God, wisdom and divine justice, like a pitiless and devouring fire, must take from him all appropriation, all that is terrestrial, carnal, and of his own activity, and having taken all this from him, they must unite him to God. This is never brought about by the labours of the creature. On the contrary, it even causes him regret, because, as I have said, man so loves what is his own, and is so fearful of its destruction, that if God did not accomplish it himself, and by his own authority, man would never consent to it. It will be objected to this, that God never deprives man of his liberty, and that therefore he can always resist God. For which reason I ought not to say that God acts absolutely without the consent of man. In explanation, I say that it is sufficient that man should give a passive consent, that he may have entire and full liberty, because, having at the beginning given himself to God, that he may do as he will, both with him and in him, he gave from that time an active and general assent to all that God might do. But when God destroys, burns, and purifies, The soul does not see that all this is for its advantage. It rather believes the contrary, and as at first the fire seems to tarnish the gold, so this operation seems to despoil the soul of its purity. So that if an active and explicit consent were required, the soul would find a difficulty in giving it, and would often not give it. All that it does is to remain in a passive contentment, enduring the operation as well as it can, being neither able nor willing to prevent it. God then so purifies this soul of all natural, distinct, and perceived operations, that at last he makes it more and more conformed to himself, and then uniform, raising the passive capacity of the creature, enlarging it and ennobling it, though in a hidden and unperceived manner, which is termed mystical. But in all these operations the soul must concur passively, and in proportion as the working of God becomes stronger, the soul must continually yield to him, until he absorbs it altogether. We do not say then, as some assert, that there must be no action, since, on the contrary, this is the door, but only that we must not remain in it, seeing that man should tend towards the perfection of his end, and that he can never reach it without quitting the first means, which, though they were necessary to introduce him into the way, would greatly hinder him afterwards, if he attached himself obstinately to them. This is what Paul said: "I forget those things which are behind, and reach forth unto those things which are before. I press toward the mark." Should we not consider a person destitute of reason, who, after undertaking a journey, stopped at the first inn, because he was assured that several had passed it, that a few had lodged there, and that the landlord lived there? What the soul is required to do then is to advance towards its end, to take the shortest road, not to stop at the first point, and, following the advice of St. Paul, to suffer itself to be led by the Spirit of God, who will lead it to the end for which it was created, which is the enjoyment of God. It is well known that the sovereign good is God, that essential blessedness consists in union with God, and that this union cannot be the result of our own efforts, since God only communicates himself to the soul according to its capacity. We cannot be united to God without passivity and simplicity, and this union being bliss, the way which leads to it must be the best, and there can be no risk in walking in it. This way is not dangerous. If it were, Christ would not have represented it as the most perfect and necessary of all ways. All can walk in it, and as all are called to blessedness, all are called to the enjoyment of God, both in this life and in that which is to come, since the enjoyment of God is blessedness. I say the enjoyment of God himself, not of his gifts, which can never impart essential blessedness, not being able fully to satisfy the soul, which is so constituted that even the richest gifts of God cannot thoroughly content it. The desire of God is to give himself to us, according to the capacity with which he has endowed us, and yet we fear to leave ourselves to God. We fear to possess him, and to be prepared for divine union. You say, we must not bring ourselves to this condition. I agree to that, but I say too that no one ever could bring himself to it, since no man could ever unite himself to God by his own efforts, and God himself must do the work. You say that some pretend to have attained it. I say that this state cannot be feigned, any more than a man dying of hunger can for any length of time pretend to be satisfied. It will soon be known whether or no men have attained this end. Since then none can arrive at the end unless he be brought there, it is not a question of introducing people to it, but of showing them the way which leads to it, and begging them not to rest in those practices which must be relinquished at God's command. Would it not be cruelty to show a fountain to a thirsty man, and then hold him bound, and prevent his going to it, leaving him to die of thirst? That is what is being done now. Let us all be agreed, both as to the way and the end. The way has its commencement, its progress, and its terminus. The more we advance towards the terminus, the further we go from the commencement, and it is impossible to reach the terminus but by constantly going farther from the starting point, being unable to go from one place to another without passing through all that comes between them. This is incontestable. Oh, how blind are the majority of men who pride themselves upon their learning and talent! O Lord, how true it is that Thou hast hidden Thy secrets from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes!